Good morning, everyone. Hey, good to see you back. Hey, if you were here last week, you may know we kicked off kind of a brand new series to sort of start our year. It's called Mind Your Busyness. Mind Your Busyness. And if you weren't here last week, it's okay. You can either catch up online or trust me, you will catch up pretty quickly this morning because we're talking about kind of this universal idea that we live in a busyness culture. We live in a busy world. People are busy. You might be busy. And if you're not busy, there's people around you that I guarantee you are busy. And when we're busy, here's what we like to tell ourselves. This is just a season, and things are going to get simpler. Maybe you've said that to yourself, you've said that to others. Maybe you've come to the realization at this point in your life that if something actually lasts weeks or months or years, it's no longer a season, right? We should call it what it rightfully is. It is a lifestyle. That's what it is. And I hear even from people who have retired, who've like sort of left their day job. And some of those people will tell you their life is busier now than it's ever been. The idea is things don't get simpler. Like they usually don't get simpler. And it makes sense. If you think about it over time, two things happen. Over life, we tend to pick up more responsibility and we end up having to handle more relationships. I mean, some of you I know, you're in school, you're students. Every year that goes by as a student, you pick up more responsibility. In your workplace, you're often asked to do more and do more as you climb a ladder, as you move forward, more responsibility. Maybe it's in your life, in your home, you're picking up more responsibility, stuff to manage. Relationships starts out easy, you just have everybody focused on you. Then pretty soon you pick up more acquaintances. Hopefully you pick up more friendships. Maybe you pick up a significant other. Maybe you have a child. Maybe you have children. Maybe you're at the point where you have aging parents and they need your time. They need your attention. These two things right here, the more responsibility, the more relationships, you know what they add up to? They add up to more activity, more productivity, potentially more busyness. And busyness, we said it last week, we're going to say it again this week, it can take a toll on us. People are busy and they feel the effects. You talk to people and they say, man, I'm tired, I'm worn out. I mean, physically tired, but not just that. We're talking weary, spent, run down, overrun in life, right? I know we love the phrase, the early bird gets the worm. You know what the early bird really gets? Less sleep. I mean, that's what I think the early bird just gets tired. And some of you recognize you're tired. Maybe you're growing more tired, like in some area of life. You're starting to feel maybe those ongoing cumulative effects of all of the stuff and the activity in your life. And that's why we're kicking off this series, Mind Your Busyness, because we're checking on our pace of life to see if there's anything that we need to pay attention to. Are there any adjustments we might want to make? I think we all want to make the best use of our time. We do. I don't think any of us wants to jeopardize our health, our well-being in any area of life because of having a disordered schedule. I don't think anybody wants to wake up someday down the road and recognize that days, weeks, months, years of their life just kind of vanished, disappeared in the midst of all of this chaos. And so it is a challenge for all of us. We've got to find a way to be active, to be productive, to work, but not let that stuff set the agenda for us and pull us away from the things that we actually value. In other words, we need to mind our busyness. We need to pay attention to it. Listen, I'm going to be clear. It's not about eliminating everything. We said this last week. This is not trying to eliminate all of the activity of your life. This idea is not pushing you toward laziness. It's not saying put life in neutral and let's just be idle. No, work is good. It's a good thing. In fact, it's God-given. It's God-given. From the very beginning, God has hardwired us to be people that are designed to work. To be active. He's called us to work and be active. It is what it means to be made in God's image. And yet, whether we like it or not, we do have some limitations. We have limitations, physical limitations. We have mental, emotional, financial, relational limitations. Like we can only do so much. We only have the same amount of time, and things can get out of order. And when they do, we feel the adverse effects of the busyness. And so do the people around us. So do the people that we care about. So much so last week, this was the challenge. And again, if you weren't here, this is an easy way to catch up. Last week, we finished with just kind of a question, a busyness wellness check. I encourage you last week, maybe this week, if you have time, take a few moments, ask yourself the question, are there any areas of my life where maybe things have gotten off center? Are there any ways in which I've become distracted by all of the activity, all of the things going on? Have I shifted too much attention into one pool or the other? In other words, are there ways that we are filling up our lives And yet, really, truthfully, we're living unfulfilled. Because we step back, we ask these types of hard questions, the evaluation questions. It's possible that you might find an area. You may find more than one area that you want to correct or redirect. And that's where we're picking it up here in week 2. Today, we're talking all about this big idea right here, reorientation. Reorientation. I'll tell you right up front, it's all about either getting properly oriented or somehow staying rightly oriented when it comes to how we use our time. And sometimes we need a reorientation. We've got to make adjustments to how we relate to all the stuff that's happening around us. So I'm going to start with a word picture. When I think about reorientation, I think about pilots. I always thought it'd be fun to be a pilot. I bet if I asked for a show of hands, some of you in the room are pilots. You probably have a license to fly some large vehicle on the sky by yourself. That would be amazing. And we know it takes a lot of work to get licensed to be a pilot. But there is a certain type of training that pilots go through that I find very interesting, and it's called recovering from an unusual attitude. Now, it looks like it should say altitude, but it doesn't. It's an unusual attitude, because when you're in an airplane, an unusual attitude is anytime the plane is out of position. So if your nose is too far up, for example, too far down, or maybe you're even inverted at that point, or stalled, or worse yet, maybe you're in a spin. If you're a pilot, you've got to know how to recover from this unusual attitude. And I was talking to a friend of mine. He used to fly fighter pilots. And he told me about this, and especially if you're at that level or you're an aerobatic pilot, he said they'll take you up in an airplane and they'll either blindfold you or they'll put a hood over your head or they'll just shield you in some way. And then they fly you all over, all different orientations, everywhere else. And then in a moment, guess what they do? They pull off the hood. And you've got to figure out how to get oriented and get oriented quickly before it all comes crashing down. For some of you, that's what your morning looks like. You wake up, right? You open your eyes. Somebody pulls the blindfold off, and you're looking around. You're like, I got a to-do list. I've got this agenda, and it just, I don't know, you check your email while you're still lying in bed, right? This calendar of events, you get messed up. You're out of balance, and you're trying quickly to figure out, what do I put in order? How do I get this thing started today? How do I adjust the orientation of my life? And it's a minor tweak sometimes. Sometimes it's a major adjustment. We've got to deal with the unusual attitudes of our schedule. That's the process, reorientation. We have to get rightly oriented. And when we are oriented rightly, we've got to try to stay there. That's what it means to mind our busyness. But if we're going to do that, we do need some skills. And that's the talk today. We're talking about some practical skills, tips, call them life hacks, whatever you will. They're going to help us along the journey. We've got to learn practices that allow us to get and stay oriented. And today we're going to turn to Jesus as our example, because Jesus gives us a couple of key starting points. I'll call them habits or best practices about how to get and stay oriented amidst the busyness of life. And these two ideas that we see in Jesus' life come from a story that we find in Mark chapter 1. And so if you've got a Bible and you want to turn there, feel free. All of this will be up on the screen, and you can just kind of follow along with it. Mark is one of the 4 writers. He writes one of the Gospels in our New Testament. One of the writers who chronicles Jesus' life, tells us all of the different things that Jesus had to deal with and all of the activity of his days. And you'll see that Jesus actually had a lot of activity in his days. In fact, one of the authors I appreciate, his name was Kevin DeYoung. He wrote a book called Crazy Busy. He said, many of us are so familiar with the Gospels, maybe you've read them before, that we fail to see the obvious. He says Jesus was a very busy man. And he goes on to say that essentially some people may have this impression that Jesus was just kind of a nomad who just wandered around all day. He wouldn't have any idea what it's like to kind of live in the real world, certainly not the world that we live in here and now. And I would argue that Jesus, more than anyone, actually had to make the most of his time here on earth. He had to navigate busyness challenges all the time. Jesus had crowds that were clinging to him all the time, people looking for him, people demanding his time, demanding his attention. If Jesus were alive today, trust me, he would get more spam email than any of us. He would, right? He'd have people calling and texting constantly. I don't know if Jesus is an Apple or an Android kind of guy, smartwatch guy, but silence the notifications. He would get hit up all the time. Everybody wanted a piece of his time, a piece of his day. And so he had all the work he wanted, plenty of things to keep him busy. And one of these days is on display for us. Mark, again, this author, in the first chapter of his gospel, gives us an example of what a day looks like in Jesus' life. And it starts in the morning. He said that Jesus and his companions, they went to the town of Capernaum. And so he had traveled there with his friends. And as they often would do, it says when the Sabbath day came, he, Jesus, went into the synagogue and he began to teach. Not uncommon for Jesus. Preparing to teach was part of his regular workload. He would go and spend time being that rabbi, teaching people. And if you go to Mark chapter 1 yourself and you read the rest of that story, you'll see that, yes, he went there to teach, but it was a very difficult day of teaching. He got disrupted and interrupted, and there was kind of a volatile situation and distraction. And that's often the case where Jesus went. Somehow it seemed to follow him. He seemed to invite those moments, people who had needs, people who wanted to challenge him and be a distraction in different ways. So he had a full morning of teaching. He had to deal with that kind of activity, and that was the start of the day. And then from there it says he left the synagogue with James and John, and they went to Simon and Andrew's home. And I would imagine they walked a ways, maybe hoping to relax, have some downtime after work, sit down, maybe grab lunch. But when they got there, he found out there was something else that needed to be managed. It says that Simon's mother-in-law was sick in bed with a high fever. And of course, what do? They tell Jesus about her right away. So he goes and kind of steps into this emotional situation, pressing situation. Jesus did what he often did. He stepped in, he stepped up, and it says that he went to her bedside, he took her by the hand, he helped her sit up, then the fever left her. And then they finally got to eat. She prepared a meal for them. So it would seem like your morning is over, your midday work is over. It's time to call it a day, but it's not over yet. It's not over for Jesus. Look what happens next. It says that evening, same day, after sunset, many sick and demon-possessed people were brought to Jesus, said the whole town gathered at the door. And so Jesus healed many people who were sick with various diseases. And he cast out many demons. This is a day in the life. It's a day in the life of this former carpenter from Nazareth. You get just a taste, right, of Jesus' lifestyle. Sort of the demands that are heaped on him moment after moment. And I know that there's some of you in the room, you're like, yeah, I empathize with that. I can sympathize with that. Some of you have full schedules. You know what it's like, right? You know what it's like to have a to-do list that is a mile long. You've got stuff stacked up one after the other. You've got people stacked up one after the other. Maybe you work for someone who has extremely high expectations. Maybe you have a travel schedule. Maybe you have to work nights or weekends. Maybe you've got unexpected things and these things that just pop up over and over. Urgent stuff that's waiting for you. Maybe you've got kids, family, others that are looking to you to manage stuff day after day. Jesus knows a thing or two about busyness. I've dealt with busyness, you've dealt with busyness, but I'll tell you what, I've never had an entire town show up at my door. Like, that has not happened. Thankfully, that is like an introvert's nightmare, right? Man, like, Jesus was a rock star. I mean, at times he'd have thousands of people following him, demanding his time and attention. They wanted a piece of him. They wanted a piece of his time. And I think about that, and I think it would have been so easy for him, especially with his capacity, with his capabilities, to sort of give into that, to give into those pressures, get buried under the demands of that life. Jesus should have been more overrun and overstressed than any of us. And yet, if you read through, again, you'll see, while this activity swirled around him, here's the truth about Jesus. Somehow, he seldom, if ever, seemed frantic. Like Jesus didn't seem hurried or rushed or anxious or irritable. Somehow he wasn't even distracted by the unimportant things, even sometimes the urgent things. Jesus sort of sets a standard for us. We can take some cues from him. We've got to learn from him. Jesus somehow stayed centered. He stayed on track in the middle of all these things that can quickly derail us. So the real question is, and this is the big question, how did Jesus get oriented? How did he stay oriented in the middle of all this activity? And the answer is he had some habits. He had a couple habits. He had a couple of key practices that he gave himself to that allowed him to consistently get oriented and stay oriented when busyness was piling up around you. And we're going to look at those. Here's the first one. Here's the first habit that Jesus had. As much as he was an active guy, always on the move, Jesus did this. He prioritized times of quiet. Jesus always prioritized times of quiet. And when I say prioritize, I mean he fought for times of quiet. He created times of quiet. He took intentional time to go somewhere to be unhurried. He made a priority to step out of the noise and find a quiet place. We see this in the very same story. Right after all of that stuff happened, it says before daybreak the next morning, what did he do? Jesus got up. It said he went out to an isolated place to pray. After all that went on, he hit reset. He hit reset. He was active. He was productive, but he took time to hit reset. He said, I need quietness. I need some solitude. I need some intentional time to get rightly oriented. And we see this pattern, this habit repeated over and over as we read it through the gospel writers. When things got busy, Jesus intentionally took time to get away. And Jesus didn't always wait to get away when everything was done. He did it in the middle of a lot of the action. It wasn't like, I'll push that to the weekend. I'll wait until everything that people expect of me is done, then I'll rest. No, he said, I'm breaking away. I'm getting it alone. I'm going to be quiet. He needed to hear from God in those moments to get some direction. I think Jesus knew if he didn't stop, if he didn't get alone, he would run the risk of getting off track and getting overrun. And I think he prioritized that time of quiet, yes, time with God, because he didn't want to lose sight of the things that he cared about most, the things that he was called to. Jesus wanted to make sure that he was still the one setting his agenda. Whether that was getting focused or staying focused, he didn't want all that busyness to dictate life to him. And we've got to do the same thing. We've got to prioritize, find moments, create moments where we get away and have some quiet in the middle of all the noise. And it's hard to do. It's hard to do. I know many of you, it's hard. You think, I don't have any place in my life that's quiet, right? Jesus got up before daybreak. I don't know what time that is. That sounds early. I don't know what time day breaks, but any time that happens, that's early, right? And I'm not a morning person, so that doesn't work for me. But Jesus, it's not about doing it in the morning. It's about finding a time, some time in your life. Maybe, just maybe for you, that is the only time. Maybe you're like, I have to get up 10 minutes earlier to find some quiet. It's the only quiet moment I have in my day. Some of you, it's at night. Maybe it's after finally the kids are in bed. Finally, that the house has settled down, even just for a moment. That's when I'm going to have my moment of quiet. Maybe it's when you go to work, and instead of just running inside, you're just sitting in your car, in the parking lot with the heat on, just sitting there 5 minutes, 10 minutes before you go in, just saying, God, I need to spend some time with you. Maybe you take a walk after dinner. Fight for it. Sit, meditate, just be quiet. Step back from the noise. Yes, pray, talk to God. Give him a few minutes to say, God, bring some order to the disorder. Bring some direction to the disorientation. And we can't wait until it's too late to do that. We have to do it regularly in the midst of all of our activity. See, we learn this from watching Jesus. He takes intentional time to find quiet, to make sure he's not going in the wrong direction. And we would do well to follow that. But here's the thing. You've got to do it because busyness doesn't settle down. Jesus went out, he found this isolated place to pray, and it says the others went to find him. I'm sure glad you got away. We followed you. Simon and the others, when they found him, guess what they said? Everyone's looking for you. Where have you been? I know it's daybreak. The day has broken. Guess what? There's more needs. There's more things to do, another project, another deadline. There's more people waiting for your time. Shocker, right? They have expectations and plans for Jesus. The thought is we're going back to Capernaum because there's still a list of people in that town that need you. But I want you to pay attention to Jesus' response. This is so important. But Jesus knew all of that, and he replied to them. He said, yeah, let's go somewhere else. Translation, we're leaving. We're leaving. We're going to go somewhere else. We're going to nearby villages. I'm going to preach there also. That is why I've come. You came out. You found me. I know that. You've got urgent things you really want me to do. But I'll tell you what, I've got some important things that I need to do. And yes, there are people that have needs and expectations and hopes for me, but we are leaving because there's other stuff I've got to give attention to. Jesus could have just followed along, again, hopped back into all of that expected activity, but he didn't. He didn't. And with that, he kind of gives us this second habit, this second practice that Jesus did pretty regularly. Not only did he prioritize times of quiet, he protected his schedule. He really did. Jesus protected his schedule. In other words, he guarded his time carefully. He had to make some tough choices about things he said yes to, things that he said no to. And he had to make those tough choices all the time. And we've got to make those tough choices. Like, we've got to protect our schedules. I'm going to use a different word. Jesus was a great editor. Jesus edited his schedule. He's put guardrails on his time. And if we are going to protect our time, we've got to become better editors, saying yes and saying no when it comes to different opportunities. Think about editing. I want to think about this for a moment. Think about editing. Think about storytellers, right? Think about authors. Think about, people who write music, movie directors. Movie directors are great editors. Some of you have a favorite movie, right? My wife is a Star Wars fanatic, and we love to go see movies in the theater. And if you have a favorite movie, you know the one you want. You love to see it in the theater. Nowadays, things just jump to streaming, it seems like. But when you see it in the theater, this is what it was like in the olden days. You'd have to wait months after that movie came out to actually get what's called a DVD. I know it's round, it's plastic, and it goes in a box, and it plays a movie, right? But you wait for the DVD, and it always has bonus features. Love that. And one of the bonus features were deleted scenes. And so you get your favorite movie, and all of a sudden you get to see some deleted scenes. Sometimes they even have an alternate ending. Remember that? Like a completely different ending. It's so amazing. And you recognize that while your movie is 2+ hours long, there's actually a lot more footage that you never saw. It's all on the cutting room floor. There are plot points. There are tons of characters that you never got introduced to. There are tons of scenes that you will never see in that potential story. Because the best stories, the best movies, the best books, the best music, they've all been edited. Tons of yes and no decisions go into writing that best story possible. And it sort of begs the question, why not just add it all? Besides the movie being 12 hours long. The reality is every small addition, good or bad, it changes the complexion of the movie. Like it changes the story. It alters the flow. It alters the movement. Sometimes to add one thing in, to add another character in, changes everything else. The idea is this: just because something is good and it's available doesn't mean that the author and the writer automatically includes it in the story. And the same thing really should be said of our calendars. In life, if we're going to mind our busyness, we need to edit. We need more deleted scenes. We need more footage of our life sort of on the cutting room floor. Sometimes there are chapters, plot points, and dare I say it, sometimes even characters that we don't need to write in to the story of our life. See, Jesus protected his schedule by being that editor, and the busier he got, the more important it became. He had to make choices about when to say yes to different or new activity and when to say no to different activity. And that's the hard thing, right? The hardest part of protecting and editing our schedule. The hardest part of editing your schedule, it's not saying yes. It's learning to say no. It's learning to say no. And I don't say this to point any fingers, but the truth is this. Some of you are busy. Some of you are busy. Maybe you're overworked, you're overrun, you're overwhelmed. And you think it's because of your circumstances. But quite possibly it's just your inability to say no. Because saying no is so hard. It's often the last thing we want to do. We want to be active. We want to be productive. And we convince ourselves we don't have to say no to anything. We don't. We just think if we manage it better, maybe we can squeeze it all in, right? I'm going to buy a new planner. I'm going to get a new calendar. I'm going to be a little bit smarter. I'm going to get a little more disciplined. I'll reorganize this. I'll find a better carpool. Maybe I'll double book. I'll just multitask. I'm going to find an app that's going to point me in the right direction. The truth is we think we can manage our way out of busyness. And we can't always do it. Because the real issue is not that we're managing it poorly, it's just we don't have enough deleted scenes. We're hesitant to limit our involvement in different activities. We don't want to say no. It's so hard to learn to say no. Saying yes feels easier, saying no is hard. And we know why it's hard. We know why it's hard, right? Because when we say no, here's the truth. We miss out on good opportunities. And we do. I mean, it's easy to say no to the things we don't care about, right? Things we don't want to do. Those are easy. We scratch those off. But the challenge is there are so many good things that wait for us. when we walk outside these doors. There's good experiences. Sometimes getting further ahead at work, that is a good thing. That is a good opportunity. Family activities, good opportunities. Involvement, sports, extracurriculars, theater, all of these hobbies, taking vacations, traveling to these events, all of those are good opportunities, and it's hard to choose between them, and it's hard to say no to any of them. And that's probably the biggest challenge to saying no. We don't want to miss. We don't want to miss out. These are good opportunities. How could they ever be a bad thing? But they change the complexion of the story, don't they? Not only do we miss out on good opportunities, when we learn to say no, we risk disappointing good people. And for some of you, that's the tough one. Like that is the tough one. Sometimes when you say no to something, it involves saying no to someone. And when we protect our schedules and we turn down opportunities, there are people on the other end of those decisions. We don't want to disappoint people. We don't like that. Like we don't want to let other people down. It feels selfish sometimes. Like it feels very selfish, right, to not meet someone else's need, especially if you know it's there, to meet that expectation. We want to be helpful. We're compelled to do it. We don't want to disappoint. Quite frankly, we don't want to be disapproved of either, right? And we fear sometimes if we say no, if I'm that person that says no, I will be disapproved of. And nobody wants to be at odds with someone else. So a lot of times it feels personal, and that's what makes it hard. And so it's just easier to say yes. We say yes, and we say yes. Why? Because to feel selfish, to disappoint someone, to disapproved of, man, it's easier to say yes to people and just be miserable than it is to say no and have them think that we're miserable people. And we're just trying to edit. See, Jesus is a good example for us. He lived with unrelenting demands. Continuous pressure. Even his closest friends, they were the first to follow him, the first to find him, to monopolize, to manipulate his time. But Jesus knew. He knew. He said, if I'm gonna fulfill the true purpose that God has for me, I've got to protect the schedule. I'm going to have to learn to say no. Maybe you never recognize that Jesus said no to good opportunities and to good people all the time. And it was in his power to fix it. And you may need to do the same thing. See, being a great editor of your time, catch this, don't miss this. It's not about living selfishly. It's about living purposefully. Like being a great editor, it's not about being selfish, it's about being purposeful. And Jesus was careful. He wanted to make sure that he was connecting his schedule, his activity, his time with people to the purposes that God had for him, much more than it was attaching that to the approval of the general public around him. And Jesus understood this dynamic, that sometimes when he said no to something important, it actually freed up space for him to say yes to something else. There were a lot of times that Jesus did less and ended up then doing more. He understood saying no to a certain thing over here meant, yes, I can say something over here. If you pass up this opportunity right now, it feels like a great opportunity. It frees up the space and the time and the finance and the resource and the mental well-being to grab another good opportunity. Like there's a reason that Jesus didn't rush back into Capernaum. Capernaum was a good opportunity filled with good people, and he said no. But as he said no to Capernaum, what did he say yes to? I'm going to go somewhere else. There will be another village, another town. They need me as well. It wasn't about a selfish choice. It was about a purposeful choice. Jesus said no. Good opportunities and good people all the time. And sometimes we've got to do the same thing. Listen, Jesus sets a good example. He's got some habits that you'll see regularly. He does prioritize times of quiet. He fights for, creates space where he gets out of the noise to get reset. But more than that, he sets some limits, some guardrails on how and when and where and with whom he uses his time. Listen, if you're sitting here today, maybe you're tired. You might be tired. You may be overloaded. You may be overrun. You may be running on fumes or running everywhere, every day. Maybe you're doing it well and you're meeting everyone else's needs. You're chasing down the demands of everybody else. And I wish that I could tell you that's just a season. But I'd be lying to you. It's probably not a season because life has a way of getting complicated, more complicated. It gets filled with more responsibilities. And ultimately, we end up handling more relationships. And if we're not careful, it takes a hold. It sets the agenda. And it takes a toll on our ability to rightly see forward. to stay oriented in the middle of it all. And it distracts us from the things that God may want to do in us. And next week, as we wrap up this whole series, we're going to talk about what that would look like. What does it mean to stay connected with God and follow his agenda in the middle of it all? But as we close up today, I'm going to leave you with another question. I left you with a question last week. I'm going to leave you with another question. I keep saying, we are the editors. Like, we are the editors of the schedule. Here's the question. What story do you want to tell? Like, what story do you really want to tell? I mean, if you're going to work and you're spending your time and your energy there, you're already telling a story with the way you use that time. Is it the right story? What story do you want to tell? Like with your hobbies or activities and the place that it holds in your life, are you telling the right story? What story do you really want to tell? How about with your most important relationships, right? Your friends, your family members, maybe it's a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner or something like that. How are you spending that time, that energy? Where is it in your calendar? What story are you telling them right now? Is it the story you really want to tell? Those of you with kids in the room, maybe you're at this point of you're a grandparent. The question is, what story do you want your kids to tell about you? Like someday when your kids are sitting, talking to someone else, and they say, man, how did my mom, how did my dad, how did my stepmom, my stepdad, my aunt, my uncle, how did they spend their time? How did that impact me and impact my story? What story do you want to tell when it comes to your kids, to those most important relationships? See, Jesus said, I know the story I want to tell. He says, I know why I came. It wasn't about being selfish. It was about being purposeful. He said, I've come to do what God has called me to do, and that's why he protected his time. Great editors always have to reconcile the ability to say yes and the ability to say no. And for some of you, as you think about the story that you're writing and the story that you want to tell, there may be some ways you have to say no. But as you say no to those things, there's an opportunity then for you to say yes, to add those plot points, to add those characters to the story. And when we become better editors, you know what we're going to write? Better and better stories. When we become better editors, we are going to write better and better stories. So next week, come on back. Mind Your Busyness, Part 3. There are a few final things that we're going to say about this important topic before we wrap it up, and you will not want to miss it. So we'll see you next Sunday. Let me pray for us as we close up today.